It's been said that babies are born with only two fears, and that's the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. Now, when I first heard that, my first thought was, well, someone had to test that out to know whether that's true or not. But anyway, every single one of us are born with just two natural fears, the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. And so what that also tells us is that all the other fears that we experience in life are learned fears, or fears that we accumulate through experiences. That may be the fear of loss, that may be the fear of rejection, or maybe even the fear of failure. But as I was getting ready for this talk this past week, one of the things that I found online was this, that the top two fears that people have are the fear of death and the fear of the unknown. Think about that. The fear of the unknown is right up there with the fear of death. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, that's true, and I can see how that would be the case. Because I know for me, when I watch a scary movie, I'm not necessarily as fearful of the monster or maybe the clown. I'm actually more fearful about what's around the corner. You know, if you're watching that movie and you see this guy walking down this hall on this creaky old floor in this really old house, and he's getting ready to open the door, and inside you're thinking, don't open the door because you don't know what's inside. Because we are people that always seem to fear the unknown. And it doesn't change from a movie to life. We experience this in our life too. That maybe you're fearful of, hey, I don't know what the new year is going to hold. Maybe you're plagued by fear because you don't know what's going to happen with your parents, and even if they're going to go through with the divorce. Maybe what you're fearful about is that you don't know where you're going to go to college, and you don't know how this relationship's going to turn out. And so what happens is we have all of these fears, and sometimes they translate to anxiety. They even breed about stress, or maybe even at times depression. And that's why life is not like going through the plains of Kansas and driving through and being able to see miles and miles off into the distance about how every little thing is going to turn out and what's going to happen next. Life's not like driving through Kansas, but life is like driving through the Rockies or the Cherokee Mountains. That there's times that we're driving through life and it's tight twists and corners. And we don't know what's next. We don't know what's beyond the horizon. And so we travel life through all these unknowns. And what can happen is as we go through these unknowns, what we do is we kind of grip ourselves to the fear of what could happen. And we anchor ourselves to the possibilities of what could take place instead of anchoring ourselves to God. And so I don't know if you guys watch Star Trek or not, but there's a line in the show that says that one of the goals of the USS Enterprise is to take man where no man has gone before. And I think about that with us, that a lot of us want to go where no person's gone before. We want to achieve great things, but what happens is that fear paralyzes us. And we let the unknowns and the what ifs hold us back from achieving anything. And so basically what we're doing is we're living by sight and we're not living by faith. And so if you have that desire to go into those unknown situations, here's what I want to tell you is this. You don't have to know the unknown to be safe. I want to say that again. You don't have to know the unknown to be safe. In fact, there's a lyric in one of the songs that I love, and the lyric is this, that we need to step out of the comfort zones into the realm of the unknown where Jesus is. To step out of our comfort zones into the realm of the unknown where Jesus is. I love that because I keep picturing Peter in that boat getting called out in the middle of the storm to step out and get near Jesus. And we focus on the storm, we focus on the fact that he walked on water and then he fell in. But I think there's a part in that text that we tend to forget, is that what Jesus is also illustrating is that sometimes I'm going to call you into an unknown situation, but when you step into that situation, one thing is true, I'm there. And so yes, the unknown is exactly as it's described to be. It's unknown. But that doesn't mean that we're not safe, because when we step into those unknown situations, we're stepping into one of the greatest adventures of our life, because we're actually stepping into a place with God. And I think what God is teaching us with Peter and Jesus is that God is a God that can be trusted. And so when I think about the fear of the unknown, there's a character in the Old Testament that screams faith amidst the unknown situations, and that's the prophet Elijah. Elijah was a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. And at the time, the northern kingdom was a very cruel, wicked place to have to live in because it was ruled by a guy named Ahab. And what we know about Ahab is Ahab was probably one of the most cruel, wicked leaders of all time. One of the things that he would make his people do is sacrifice their own babies and their own children to worship the gods. And these false gods were what people were worshiping. And so what was happening to the culture, it was literally in a sinful decay. And so God calls Elijah to go into one of the most sinful cultures of all time and to pronounce a judgment on them. And so if you look in 1 Kings 17 verse 1, Elijah walks into the courts of King Ahab and he said, hey, the God of Israel has sent me. And what he's letting you know is that because you're so evil, because you're so sinful, that God is going to send this to you. No rain. There's going to be no rain or no dew for years. Now, the idea of not having rain to us may not seem like that big of a deal, but to them, this is a huge deal. Keep in mind, most of the people were probably farmers. They owned cattle. And so in order for them to make a living, it depended upon them having rain. And so if you think about it, if there's no water, the crops are going to die. If there's no water, their animals are going to die. But also if there's no water, the people are going to die too. Because it's been said that we can only live without water for 8 days. And the closest body of water is the Mediterranean Sea, which is filled with salt. Can't drink that one. And so what's happened is basically Elijah is pronouncing to King Ahab and his people a death sentence. Now, you have to think about now what Elijah might be feeling. He's got to be scared to death. I'm going to walk into one of the most powerful, scary people of our time's courts, and I'm going to pronounce a death judgment on him. He's not going to like it, so he may want to kill me. But not only that, but now I'm going to be living in this culture, and what am I going to drink? I mean, am I going to be like them, and I'm going to die after 8 days too? And so you know he's wondering how God is going to provide for him in this very unknown situation. But it's interesting, once you get to verse 2, we see God's provision. And here's what he tells him. He said, actually, I want you to go to the far east. And when you go to the east, you'll see a brook there. And I'm going to provide for you by that brook. And so as he's by this brook, surely enough, he gets there and God provides him water. But then God does something very unusual next. He sends ravens down from the sky bringing meat and bread. So he eats that meat and he eats the bread. He's enjoying the water from the brook. But then verse 7 comes and it shows that the water from the brook completely runs out. So now he has no water. But yes, maybe the water ran out. But here's the thing. God's provision doesn't. And so because God's provision doesn't run out, God steps in and says, all right, now I have another unusual request for you. Since there's no water here, I want you to go to this widow's house. And you go to this widow's house, and what I want you to understand is there's going to be jars of oil and jars of flour that you will have for you to provide for you all the things that you need. And so sure enough, he goes to this widow's house. He said, hey, I need you to help provide for me. She said, I don't have anything but these empty jars, and I have these empty jars of flour and oil, so I don't really know what I'm going to give you. But if you notice in the text that God actually gets those empty vessels, those empty jars, and he fills them with a never-ending supply of flour and oil. And so as I look at this text, I'm like, all right, number one, God called Elijah to step into a very unknown situation, to go into one of the most powerful men in the world's courts and pronounce a death judgment. And then on top of that, God then gives him the provision he needs through the water and through the ravens. But then, of course, God ends up telling him to go to this widow's house, and he provides for him there too. And so as I'm looking at this text, if you're trekking with what's happening here, number one, you notice how God is giving him some very unusual requests. To go to this brook and let ravens feed you. And here's why that's so unusual. Ravens are unclean animals. So God is saying, listen, I can use a very unusual thing to bring about your provision. But then you think about the widow. Again, you go to this widow's house and she's going to provide for you basically just these empty jars, but I'm going to fill them. Again, a very unusual request. And so what that tells me is that sometimes in those fearful situations, those unknown situations, that God will call us into some very unusual spots. But just because something is unusual does not mean that it's not sent from God. In fact, sometimes the more unusual it is, the more odd it is, sometimes the more obvious it is something from God. that God does not operate within our own mode of thinking. He thinks beyond, at times, what we even see, can think, or even imagine. And so here in this situation, God uses very unlikely things to give him provision, and very unlikely things for him to use as he steps into his call. But another thing that I notice in this part of the text is that God is basically sending Elijah into situations where Elijah has no other choice but depend upon God. I want to say that again, that God is sending him into situations to where he has no other choice but to depend upon God. God will call us into situations at times where literally he wants our resources to run out so he can swoop in with his. And though while certain things of our maybe physical blessings or things that we see around us may run out, God's provision never runs out. And so what I want to do is I want to give you 4 quick lessons that I think we can learn about the fear of the unknown from Elijah and in his story here with King Ahab. And the first one is this, that whenever God calls us into the unknown, he always goes with us. Whenever God calls us into the unknown, he always goes with us. Elijah experienced that. And whether you realize it or not, you experience it too. It's because at the very end of the book of Matthew, there's the Great Commission. And that Great Commission says to go into all the world, to go into the unknown, and to share the gospel with people. And that scares us at times, but if you look at that text, it's actually bracketed by 2 divine things. In the very beginning of that, it says, all authority has been given to me. That's divine power. And then he ends it by saying, I will be with you till the very end. That's divine presence. And so what I'm telling you is that whenever God calls you into the unknown, your unknown situation is actually bracketed by the divine power of God and God's divine presence. When he calls us into the unknown, he always goes with us. But here's the second thing that we need to know. That when God calls us into those unknown situations, he always gives his people that he sends. Let me say that again, that he always gives people that he sends into the unknown. God is a really good steward of the gifts that he has given us. In fact, in the book of Matthew, it says, if we know how to give good gifts, how much does our Father in heaven know how to give good gifts? He's the originator, the creator of good things and good gifts. God knows how to gift his people, and he's always a good steward of those gifts. I know for me, when I first decided to go to ministry, I sat into my dad's office and I said, hey, I was wanting to let you know that I'm thinking about going into ministry. I said, but I want to see what you think, because I'm not like a person that's really good at coming up with lessons. I'm also not a person that likes to really speak in front of people, but I really want to do it. And I said, so how do you think that's going to go? And I remember my dad said, hey, listen, you don't have to worry. Because if you want to do something that maybe God has called you to do, God is going to give you opportunities to develop those talents. And so again, I stepped into that very unknown situation. God provides me mentors, internships, and all these certain different opportunities to help me to do what I wanted to do. So again, that whenever God calls us into a situation, he always gifts the people that he sends. But here's a third thing I want us to know. That God always accompanies his call into the unknown with his provision. He always accompanies his call into the unknown with his provision. Ask Moses this. Because as Moses, of course, goes to Pharaoh and he asks for his people to be let go, of course, he doesn't listen. And so then Moses has got to be brainstorming back to that time when he was back at that burning bush. When he told God, he's like, listen, no one's going to listen to me. No one's going to do what I ask because I don't have the ability. And he lists all of those what ifs. And he's thinking that those things are coming true. But one plague after another, God brings his provision. And so for 10 straight plagues, Moses sees the provision of God. And I think what that did is it started to develop something in Moses for him to understand, if God calls me into an unknown situation, every single time he's going to provide for me. And so we see this happen as he gets to that Red Sea and the Egyptian army is getting ready to attack his people. All Moses does as he's standing at the very edge of the sea, lift both of his hands up, and then the water parts. God parted the water that day, but let me tell you what God could have also done. He could have built a bridge, he could have brought a boat, or he could taught the people how to swim. But I think what's illustrated to us in that moment is the moment that we hit our knees, the moment that we raise our hands and we say, God, you are the one that I need, is the time that God brings his provision, because he wants to get us to points where we can only depend upon him. But here's the fourth thing that we can also learn, is that as we go into the unknown, we will fail. And there will be moments of weakness, but God can redeem our failures. I think back to when I decided to go into ministry and started my work in ministry. It was just like every job everybody else has experienced, that I experienced moments that I failed. Moments where I would have done what I would have done. I would have done something different. And there's moments where I look back and I'm like, man, I wish I wouldn't have done that. And that's partially true. But also, even in those moments of my own failures, I've actually seen how in the middle of that failure, God has stepped in and redeemed it and used it for his own purpose. And maybe that's why Paul said what he did in 2 Corinthians 12:9, that God's grace is made perfect in our weakness. That just because we are weak doesn't mean that God is. That even in our own failures, God can swoop in and he can redeem it. So yes, maybe you're in an unknown situation and maybe you have failed. Don't stop going after the call. Because yes, you may have failed in that unknown situation, but don't look at it as a closed door. But look at even at that failure as an opportunity to lead you into a better transformation. There's a commercial that came out a few years ago, and I think it might have been a Kodak commercial or something like that. And it was this little girl who was getting ready to jump off a diving board for the very first time. And her dad is in the water, and he's saying, honey, you can do it, you can do it. And so with each little step, she inches towards the edge of the diving board. And she gets to the very edge of the diving board. Her dad's in the water saying, honey, jump. And the little girl's shaking her head like, nope. I'm not doing that. I'm not going to jump. And the dad's in the water like, honey, jump. And still she's like, not going to do it. And I think about that with us, that we kind of start our call and we kind of step into that unknown situation. But the further we get into it, sometimes we want to retreat and say, no, I can't do it. But God is there saying, no, come to me. I'm here. I'm telling you, I've got you if you'll just step out. And so as the commercial goes, the little girl is refusing to jump. And the father's like, honey, I promise, I've got you. And so the little girl finally jumps off that diving board. Her dad catches her. She shoots out of the water. And she says, Daddy, let's do it again. The unknown is exactly what it is described to be. It's unknown. But you don't have to know the unknown to be safe. In fact, as you step out into those unknown situations, God will provide. He will go with you. He will gift you. And even if you fail, He will redeem that failure for His purposes. So step into that unknown situation and know that it will literally be one of the greatest adventures of your life, because you are stepping into a place with God.